It was rough. Maybe Bosco will become. Okay guys, can we have some? Okay, welcome to the grand finals of IIT Bombay. On the motion that this house prefers regional conceptions of human rights as opposed to a universal one. On OG we have HomeBoys. On opening off we have ShivJena. On closing government we have NUJS2. On closing opposition we have RB4. On panel we have Sophie, Manya, Osho, Ribhu, Vignesh and myself. I invite the Prime Minister to open the case for side number. Guys, all teams will be timing you. Okay? Fast.
A year ago, South Africa refused to arrest Omar Bashir, a dictator responsible for genocide, because they believed that the ideals the ICC stood for were a Western imposition on them. Understand that human rights never have been and are not absolute. We're willing to defend a world with a more regional conception of what constitutes human rights. Two things in my speech. Firstly, why a universal conception of human rights is largely always determined by actors that are geopolitically motivated and set unreasonable expectations on countries that are developing. And secondly, on enforceability and why we can better enforce the worst kinds of crimes on our side. Before that, some setup, right? Like, look, what is this debate about? This debate is not about things like, is not about the right to life, right? We think that the right to life is uncontestably and like universally valued. So obviously, it's not going to be about the right to life. This debate is specifically about certain gray areas, right? So things like the right to free speech, as in China, or the right to say freedom of association and freedom to form political associations like Singapore. No, and these are the things that we're willing to defend. I think they often traded off for things like, say, economic rights and economic development. We think that's fine. But let's understand before getting into the first argument what human rights actually are and what they ought to be. I think firstly, human rights are provisions to protect desires for humans as sentient beings over time, right? Which means that human rights exist to protect like desires that humans value. We think that those desires often change from time to time and from region to region. So understand that human rights have never ever been absolute. But secondly, human rights are also always in contention, right? They exist to create a bar and come to a consensus of what that bar of protection is, not to be a bar in and of themselves. So for example, we often weigh off the things like the right to privacy that you can get only after a certain threshold. That's you can't use your right to privacy to infringe on the rights of someone else. So understand that human rights, are always going to be always have been and always are in contention. Let's move first on to why human rights are always determined by actors that are geopolitically motivated and set unreasonable expectations of developing countries. We think that human rights are or the universal conception of human rights has largely been defined by countries like the USA and the West. Right? Understand that these countries often have a different set of goals and ideals that exist for them. Right? So for example, like USA and the US values individual freedoms and things like privacy, things like your right to free speech and right to vote, whereas it's unreasonable to impose that same sort of imposition on countries such as say Singapore, China and Vietnam, right? Because there is a more pressing need for other issues in these countries such as say economic development, right? But why are these rights traded off to begin with? We say firstly, these rights are traded off because say for example having the right to vote in Singapore would often mean that it would come at the cost of development, at the point at which say different political parties have different motivations and different policies as to what taxation policy should be, where development funds should go and how this development should exist. So often like these rights come at the cost of your right to vote. We think these rights are also incredibly important because it means that you can provide things like employment to people, and that's also important in this debate. And for that reason, we think it's often a trade-off that we're willing to make because people value that. But more importantly, in terms of enforceability, right? Like understand that opting into institutions that enforce human rights is often a binary, right? So for example, if you opt into the ICC, then in their world, you opt into a universal charter of what constitutes human rights and what doesn't. Yeah. That very well may be the case. We think that's fine in this debate because we think it's often a trade-off between those rights and between, say, your right to economic development and your right to, say, free speech and freedom of religion. We think, so moving on to how countries tend to opt into organizations that enforce human rights. We think it's largely binary, right? Because you have to either opt into the ICC and opt into all of its provisions and charters for what constitutes human rights and not. Understand that the vast majority of countries that currently do not believe that the do not opt into the ICC do so because they believe that it is a Western imposition, right? That your enforceability of things like the right to vote and the right to free speech, curtail other rights, right? So curtail, say for example, your right to development. We think this is incredibly important because at the moment at which countries believe that, say, the right to life is uncontestably good, but do not believe that certain other things such as the right to free speech or the right to vote are good, that's the point at which they're unlikely to opt into the ICC to begin with. Because the moment you opt into the ICC, you are liable to be indicted by this universal charter of human rights, and therefore a lot of countries do not opt into these institutions to begin with. This is problematic at two levels. We think firstly, simply in terms of collecting information, right? Like the ICC's ability to send observers, say for vast regions in the African Union, so ability to send observers and be aware of the kinds of crimes that are going on that side of the house is better on our side when more countries are likely to opt into ICC, when the ICC takes into account their considerations of what human rights are and what human rights ought to be. No, but secondly, we think it's important in terms of gathering witnesses, right? So at the point at which South Africa is no longer a part of the ICC, it's very difficult to get South Africa to provide information on crimes in neighboring countries. I'm not picking anyone, because that's incredibly important for prosecuting the kinds of crimes such as, say, genocide that was committed by Omar Bashir. I think that's something you lose in this debate. But why are regional courts or regional bodies that are likely to enforce this mechanism better? We think firstly, to the extent that you collectively agree on a certain set of values and that you have agreed on, you're more likely to go out and prosecute those crimes, right? Because Because in our world, we have a world where now say regional countries in Asia can determine that the right to economic development is greater than the right to free speech and the right to vote. So they're more likely to prosecute them at the point at which they cannot say it is a Western imposition. But secondly, we think that there are power dynamics that exist within these regions, right? So for example, China will often have an incentive to prosecute crimes that they believe constitutes a crime at the point at which those crimes are committed. But thirdly, we think you're more likely to share information with regional bodies as opposed to one ICC that is often seen as a Western imposition, right? Vietnam is always going to want to share more information with China as to the kinds of crimes that are being committed because because these crimes are with regard to values that they commonly agree on, but secondly because they now have greater incentives to enforce them. Which means that we can better enforce the worst kinds of crimes on our side of the house when countries that believe that certain acts constitute crime are now better able to prosecute them. We're very happy.
I thank Prime Minister for the speech. I now invite the dialogue to open up.
Truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that the standards for what is right and what is wrong will in any world always be set by the more powerful, by some more resourceful bodies. This debate is about whether or not that body should be something that is more centralized, that idea should be something that is more centralized, or whether it should be decentralized in the way side opposition is arguing. We have a problem with the slimy way that side government has approached this debate, where they've only made this debate about very, very exceptional circumstances by saying that this debate is not about the right to life. Regional conceptions today are depriving minority communities of the right to life, and thereby we think that this debate is primarily about the right to life, if anything else. In a world where homosexuals are by law allowed to be murdered by the majority community because of these regional conceptions, where today Hindus are subject to mass genocide in Pakistan and no one in their military or their government bats an eye because of these regional conceptions, we think that this debate very well is about these fundamental rights. But let's examine even the rights that side government has spoken to you about, which they're okay with being infringed, and we don't think that they've been able to prove to us why these rights are okay to deprive their citizens of. Two things that they've said. Right to vote is apparently important to deprive. Why? Because it allows you to create more jobs. In most dictatorships today reek of the greatest unemployment rates all over the world. And in the 60s, I mean, ever since dictatorships came into play, the only thing that dictatorships have done is had the agency to allow the dictators to live the most exorbitant possible lives, while the proletarians live in malnutrition and hunger. And the only one singular example without any analysis that they've given us is Singapore, who also, by the way, more and more data comes up every single day about how Lee Kuan Yew made a vicious attempt to quash dissent in his regime. But we think that Lee Kuan Yew also in this category of dictators is possibly the best possible example. If they're going to talk to you about why it's okay with depriving the right to vote of your citizens, then you also have to defend Kim Jong-un, you also have to defend Saddam Hussein, you also have to defend Hosni Mubarak, right? We think that their burden now is to prove to you why dictatorships are inherently good, or in what cultural context they can perhaps be good. But secondly, we think that no, we don't agree that these will be some unreasonable expectations, because even if the West or the United Nations set these standards, they have to be standards that they themselves can first meet. But more importantly, at least now you have an aspirational value to progress towards something, as opposed to stagnating in one particular place for the rest of your life, right? We think the aspirational value for these standards is something that is incredibly important, right? But more importantly, we think, and this is constructive, universal conceptions and by definition do not discriminate on the basis of the identity of the righteous. Why? Because it acknowledges the needs to be applicable in any and all context, regardless of the specific nuances of those regions. For example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights defines rights as something that is granted to all citizens, regardless of their caste, regardless of their creed, their sex, their gender, or their sexual orientation. This is something that is exclusive to a universal conception of human rights, because we think that oftentimes regional conceptions of human rights have considerations that are tied up to identity, which is based on prehistoric traditions which have progressed. We agree that they have progressed, but have progressed at an incredibly slow pace. Because we think that in prehistoric times, there weren't really notions of morality. Everything was consequentialist, and society was divided as hunter-gatherer, and thereby, as a result of this, we think that there are very strict hierarchies that most of these prehistoric notions created. As a result of this, those that are at the bottom of this food chains have been open to exploitation. We as Indians understand this as what happens today to a Dalit who, when he goes ahead and tries to drink water from the same well, is beaten to death. Our country, that like Muslim women aren't allowed to enter one of the most prestigious mosques in our country. They're deprived of their right to practice their own religion, right? And we think that that is the paradigm under which religious conceptions of notions that are based entirely on prehistoric notions of morality are inherently discriminatory because of the hierarchies that they create. Daniel. In their world, ladies and gentlemen, the International Criminal Code becomes a race to the bottom, because every single victim that approaches the International every single predator that is dragged to the International Criminal Court now feels discriminated against. Because now the first thing that any country will say, and the arbitrators of those countries will say when they're representing that particular country, is no, why don't you take into consideration our cultural nuances when you did so for another country? Because one thing that I've realized as a student of law about law is that it operates merely on precedents. And so once that you have set a precedent that one Turkey is allowed to deny the genocide that took place in Armenia, most other countries are also going to be demanding the exact same right. And if you don't grant them that right, then again that cycle is repeated. When they don't come into the International Criminal Court, then again you reduce the threshold, and therefore it becomes a race to the bottom, right? We think that that is something that they simply haven't been able to prove, at least in their prime ministerial speech. But more importantly, and this is a berserk idea, where they come up and they say that no, regional courts are more accessible because now people are more comfortable going to regional courts, right? Firstly, this is ridiculous, because this is about the universal conception and not the implementation of that conception, right? So a regional court can also implement the exact same idea while making a comfortable environment for a victim to come up and tell us about what happened to him or her. We don't really understand what this idea about more reporting or more data really is. We don't think that comfort is something that they can really win this debate on. So what is it that we think that happens when you live in a world with regional conceptions of human rights? We think that your argument about there being socio-economic hegemons, or as Danyel calls them, people that have geopolitical power, still continues to exist in the form of the hierarchies that were created on prehistoric notions. In our world, that in some situation is a man, in some situation is a straight man, in some situations it's a Hindu, in some situations it's a Brahmin. The world doesn't really change. However, we think that the West and the United Nations are far more accountable than most of these organizations because of exactly the things that we told you. Firstly, because of the fact that they have a fear of being called out on the international platform, which is something that is exclusive to these actors and not something that exists within regional actors. and because of the fact that they can't ever set a standard that they themselves can meet, and most importantly, because of the fact that even if these standards are somehow unreasonable, we think that it's a fair trade-off, because we're not trying to impose any of these standards. At the very least, we can at least set an aspirational benchmark for most of these oppressive regimes to move towards, because we're the only side in this debate, at least up till now, that doesn't celebrate dictatorship. On side opposition, we're very, very proud to oppose.
I thank enough. I now invite DPM to continue government. Guys, just a small request, please don't leave the room by someone.
Sadly, for opening opposition, outrage doesn't lead to prosecution and more enforcement of human rights. We are equally devastated by the atrocities committed throughout the world. Most of the atrocities committed, the worst kinds of atrocities, go unchecked. Which means the biggest dictatorships they have a problem with, like North Korea and like South Sudan, etc., continue to commit atrocities on both sides of the house. So they can't just say, oh, that's what you have to defend on your side, because they don't do anything about those either. Which meant this debate needed to cool down and talk for a minute on how do you best protect the most basic rights for people who are worst harmed by them. What does opening opposition say to this? Firstly, they say that regional conceptions violate the right to life. Even if we agree that's the case for certain minorities, they weren't able to protect that on that side of the house. In the absence of being able to protect those minorities, they weren't sure why it was so important for them to make that argument about the relevance of that word. Which means that in and of itself can't place them above opening government, because like even if there are countries that are being genocidal today, we aren't able to prosecute them because you need a lot of things like Danyel pointed out. You need information, you need observers, you need these people to actually turn up in courts, you need policemen catching these people inside those local regions, right? It means to the extent that that's the biggest problem on your side, that's something you don't solve. Secondly, why in most cases, and like this is being reasonable in this debate, instead of just throwing examples, will the right to life and most basic rights be protected regardless of context? Firstly, we think it's very intuitive in terms of how we are as human beings to believe that people should be able to live their full life. We recognize that other individuals have dignity and other individuals should be able to conceptualize their own happiness in the best way possible. To the extent that they think they think that some conceptions of human rights are more consequentialist as opposed to the other. Even in a consequentialist framework, people recognize that you're taking away the severe consequences of other people being harmed and tortured and losing their life. So locally, inside these regions, individuals who live in these countries acknowledge that people go through a large amount of pain. That dying is probably not the best thing for people, and that you want your own right to life. But even if they aren't as charitable to other minorities in their region, right? The reason they want an overall protection of the right to life, you want that included inside regional areas, is you want those protections to exist for yourself and your future people inside your country. So to the extent that there's a minority that's prosecuted today inside these countries, just because you don't want to be prosecuted, if there's a shift in government towards the government of that minority, you are incented to create institutions that protect the right to life and the most basic rights inside these regions. Which means in most cases, there are structural reasons we've given you for why the right to life and most basic rights like protection from torture are likely to be protected, because people have a personal incentive and local governments and local individuals have a personal incentive to protect them. Which meant that all opening opposition did in this debate was to say, oh no, look at North Korea, defend that. It's not giving you any reason for why, in most cases, these people will be harmed and the most basic rights will be taken away. What then was in contention in this debate, and where is the debate? The first thing to say is that the things that are actually in contention and debate are rights which some societies think are valuable while other societies do not. I think that we agree that to a large degree the freedom of religion is one of these rights, also encoded in international charters, by the way. So that the POI about these rights are cultural and religious is something that you also believe freedom of religion is important. But secondly, we think religion gives people more meaning in different contexts, right? So if you have a religious state, you think those religious states, people in those religious states take more value out of that religion. So the point of it is that some cultural and religious practices that those people find important, like which might harm the environment, by the way, which is some like universal. So for example, if like in India, being a majority Hindu religion has like immersion of idols that pollutes the environment. It's a religious practice that people consider extremely important, but it's damaging to the right to a clean environment, right? We think like countries make that trade-off differently in different contexts because they value like things like the religious freedom much more in a particular context as opposed to the other. We don't think that opposition would be a team that would want to push atheism inside these countries, right? To the extent that they want to protect these religious freedoms and some societies value them more, that's what you're willing to defend on us. Before I get to what the real trade-off in this debate was and why we prefer regional enforcement and regional codes, go.
You at least acknowledge that while atheism shouldn't be actively preached in most of these countries, most atheists should not be murdered because of their religious beliefs in these countries, and that is a fair standard to impose on these nations.
Yes. Okay. Moving on. Regional versus international codes, right? Where do you get better enforcement? The first thing to say on this is why regional courts are not likely to be served on the worst kind of prosecution. One, do you think regional courts have an incentive to prosecute because the players, like we agree that we dominant players inside these regions, but those dominant players also have an incentive to maintain their power by prosecuting these localities. How does that work, right? So if you have a regional court set up in like the ASEAN bloc where you have less protection for democracy, but you have more protection, but you still have dominant players like Singapore, you think like local people in Singapore still are willing to go out and say that the genocide committed inside ASEAN, large killings committed inside certain regions like Myanmar are bad, while they're not willing to say that you want to sacrifice our democratic rights. So they're much more likely to opt into a court system where only like basic rights like the right to life and the freedom of torture are protected, and there's local pressure to prosecute those kinds of things, as opposed to a world where they have to opt in for a universal organization that pushes values that they don't accept onto them. So what was the trade-off then that they had to engage with? The trade-off was a world where if you force people to enter these organizations that push for the right to democracy, dictatorial states that continue to exist on both sides of the house have no incentive to share information with international institutions. What do? We allow these dictatorial states, even or states that curb your freedom of democracy, to at least prosecute like crimes such as crimes against humanity, to prosecute the worst kinds of atrocities which they had a huge problem with. So China can prosecute atrocities inside Myanmar only when they have a local court and they don't have another tussle going on with the ICC about the fight with the Philippines, right? That's something that we think is a trade-off in this debate that opposition has to deal with, but they let go prosecuting the worst kinds of crimes to stand by the principle of, these things should be universal. We were ready to go more practical standards. We think that, democracies still stay. People get economic rights in those democracies. But the worst kinds of crimes are better prosecuted when you have regional courts. Very true.
I thank Deputy Prime Minister. I now invite Deputy Hello to close out.
Okay.
Panel, the debate thus far has been uncomparative on the side of opening government. Because if you listen to their case, largely in Danyel's speech, that the debate was never really about setting the standard of what you conceptualize to be a regional human rights standard, as opposed to the debate that they wanted to have, which was, which will the manifestation be a lot better? Why is that debate problematic on the side of opening government? The reason why that is problematic is for two reasons. The first is there was no clear clarification from opening government as to what constitutes actual regional human rights standards to begin with. Because to the extent in which he wanted to engage with right to privacy, I will posit that that was the most convenient example they can engage on in this debate with respect to regional authorities. The second is that I want to say that there was very unclear lines as to what will constitute regions to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. Is it East Africa? Is it Rwanda? Is it the specific tribes that exist in specific regions in Africa, ladies and gentlemen? Because if it's any of these communities, imposition is likely to occur at some point or another by a body that is likely going to impose their policies on you. Why is a universal standard a lot better? A universal standard is based on a consensus of the universal community looking into what is the best form of moderation and compromise that we can get with in terms of human rights, because we acknowledge that irrespective of identity of politics, that there are general human rights that overlap, that cater to every single individual. I'm going to add on two things in this debate. The first is which conception is going to be better off for the world. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about why in a world where we do have the conception that they were talking about, which manifestation is going to be a lot better. But before that, several points of responses, right? I think with respect to the convenient examples that opening government wants to use in this debate, like right to privacy, surely yes, it's important, but it also must be contrasted to some regions not accounting for the rights of women being able to participate in things like abortions or the right to wear a hijab, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to make this claim, I'm really sorry, like people who believe in Hinduism, that your idols are less important than the environment, because the environment impacts everyone. If you're going to tarnish the water that everybody uses, then I'm sorry if it harms other individuals, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, they say, well, there are geopolitical interests and economic interests that we're going to prioritize, and that should be the priority in this debate. What the hell? Your economic interest often is an argument that a lot of countries around the world use as a means to oppress and discriminate against communities. Because the argument that people use is that econs is more objective, and the outcomes of economic policies will trickle down to people later on anyway, and you will get your rights later, it will manifest later. But this is a nonsensical argument. This is an argument that Saudi Arabia has used for decades upon decades to subjugate women, because they say we need to prop up our economy first before you're able to move on into attaining things like education and the right to vote. The promise is a myth on the side of opening government, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, I'm going to make this argument, right? Western imposition. They say everything white people say are bad. But I don't think they were able to indicate why this argument is necessarily true to begin with, other than to say, well, they were colonialists and impositionists. I'm going to say here that oftentimes the more developed, more Western world often achieve processes of enlightenment a lot faster than the developing world, with acknowledging overlapping human rights that often target individuals. Why is this the case? Oftentimes, the reason why this is true, because the processes of building those communities are often apolitical for these countries, because they acknowledge that the rights must transcend identities and communities, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, I think that when it comes to universal human rights and the compromise that you get, often the accountability is much stronger with that framework, because the threshold that individuals often look into is a threshold that's fair for every single country, as opposed to one that's exorbitantly high. No white country is going to ask another country, please guys, give everybody the right to drive the car, or like absolutely, but right to education, or the right to like, you know, other rights that often impact lowest communities. After closing. Yes, I said that. That's what I just said. I'm saying that it's a lot better than regional considerations. Why is that the case? Which conception is going to be a lot better? I think that regional conceptions of human rights are often non-comprehensive and potentially discriminatory, because oftentimes regions, as they are often tied to identities that are built on culture, tradition, and ritual. And oftentimes in these regions, right, human rights are like either non-consequential, because there's an overarching framework that often dictates the behavior that creates hierarchies in decisions of individuals, or tangential at best, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to look at different contexts and apply why this is likely to be the case. Sit down. I think the first thing is, when it comes to things like identity politics, often it becomes very difficult. It means sit, right? I think it becomes very difficult for people to argue against things that are often amorphous in nature or built into the structures of society to the point where it controls every single decision. Sit down. The decisions of these individuals, ladies and gentlemen. Let's look at countries like Saudi Arabia using the Quran as a means to oppress individuals by virtue of the interpretation of the Quran, and saying that the right of a woman is to be owned by the individual that currently marries her or gave birth to her, ladies and gentlemen. Or even in Asian societies and Asian regions, overwhelming narratives like filial piety, ownership, or obedience often determines the standards of human rights and often determines what should be the correct conception of human rights. That means that your ability and your value as a human being is still contingent on you fulfilling specific obligations to your communities, as opposed to you as an individual being able to retain the right. Sit down, your road to ABP is quite bumpy, right? I think secondarily as well, that often it becomes really difficult for individuals to be able to determine the right kinds of conception, and often will face rejection and an inability to criticize a lot of culture and tradition because it's been built up across societies, across tradition, across cultures, across generations, versus a universal framework that says we acknowledge perhaps we have different identities and different politics, but the thing is there are general ideas and general rights that ought to be given to individuals that should operate on an apolitical framework, one that doesn't attach identities. Which manifestation is a lot better? And this is where I'm going to talk about which side provides for a better conception of human rights. I think for the lowest common denominators in any and all region, often the standards is a lot higher for these individuals because it's not encumbered by things that are potentially determined by the communal lives that they live in, the societies that they currently live in. I think that's really important for individuals in this region to be able to aspire and hope for change, or perhaps even use this as an example or as a justification to hope for revolution in the area, or revolutionize laws and policies in that area by using universal standards as a metric in which they change their laws. But it also makes for a more constructive form of advocacy for social movements as well as social advocates when they use arguments of general human rights or universal human rights that aren't vetted by things like culture and tradition, by saying that the ability for individuals to be able to attain human rights shouldn't be subjugated by regional consensus or regional standards as to what is right, that often creates a disparate and a disproportionate treatment of individuals in specific areas, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to posit that in a world we have regional interpretation, perhaps Southeast Asian countries will flourish because perhaps their conception will be a lot fairer. But I'm going to say that perhaps for South Asian countries or like Middle Eastern countries, it is just very likely you're going to harm a lot of individuals, and I would prefer a world where we do not sacrifice individuals at any cost, be it for the argument of econs or for the arguments of politics, ladies and gentlemen. Very practical.
I thank Deputy Leader of Opposition and now invite Government Board to open closing
Panel, we think opening half has been largely ignorant in how human rights need to function, right? We do not think that the right to life can exist only if there's a universal conception of a right to life and not a regional one, right? We believe that this kind of a white man's burden that opposition has taken upon themselves essentially goes ahead and propagates the idea that what we are telling you, the way in which you have to live is the right way, the one that we tell you, right? What does this do is also portray the lifestyle that these people are living in currently to be barbaric, right? We believe that this whole debate needs to be about the effectiveness of these conceptions as compared to, oh my God, let's have a universal conception and let's not have a universal one, right? The idea of how our opening half has been until now has literally been restricted to how courts will function, right? We tell you that specifically because of this fact that people are deeply, deeply rooted in religious and cultural context, it's really important that you hit them where it affects them the most, right? We believe that the simple idea that society, culture and religion has the most amount of influence on individuals means that this is exactly where you try to bring in the idea of human rights as compared to this kind of an external imposition that will happen in the paradigm that opposition wants us to believe in, right? Having said that, we don't think that our burden is to go ahead and defend dictatorships, right? We think that dictatorships are necessarily in opposition to even regional conceptions of human rights within their own territories, right? What does this mean is that opposition today has to defend the effectiveness of having a universal conception as compared to having it as an idea itself, right? We do not see any kind of value with having simply an academic idea of what human rights need to be. We believe that until and unless they can come ahead and comprehensively prove that people, communities will be receptive to these ideas, we don't think that they will have discharged their burden adequately, right? Having said this, what is the idea of this whole idea of like government having come here and said that regional courts will go ahead and do this in a better manner, right? What is the problem with this kind of an argumentation? Two responses. Number one, we believe that all these arguments have been simply based on the effectiveness and ineffectiveness of these courts, right? But more importantly, and this is something that's often like problematic because of things like costs and access to resources, etc. But more importantly, the simple idea that you have to go ahead and target people in those ideas, in those sources of behavior that influence the behaviors of these people in communities the most is something that needs to be contended with, something that opening up has missed until now. What are regional conceptions? They ask us the simple idea that regional conceptions are literally things that are rooted in religion and culture, but which also mean that over a period of time, these things need not remain static, right? We believe that changes in regional conceptions are something that we have seen, right? The simple idea that you literally cannot prove that Saudi Arabia will go ahead and agree to the universal conception of human rights that you want to drive down their throat, as compared to the fact that many countries have gone ahead and banned triple talaq because they themselves thought that this is an idea that's problematic, is something that's proof of the fact that regional conceptions can indeed work, right? We believe that this could happen in multiple ways. For example, demands of peoples being adhered to, the ways of like changes in legislation, etc., etc., right? Having said all that, let us look at the specific extension that we bring to you on closing government, right? Speaker, understand that adaptive preferences are a thing. Adaptive preferences are essentially behaviors and responses that human beings come up with in order to ensure that they live life in the best possible manner that they can, right? What is the problem in this particular case is that human rights ensure that we do agree, ensure that by virtue of the fact that you are a human, you must have particular rights, right? But what is the problem with this kind of an external imposition? And that's exactly where our case comes into picture, right? We believe that adaptive preferences often ensure that human beings can remain happy, right? We do not think that you are in any position at all to go ahead and tell individual communities, even the most vulnerable person that you're so worried about, that the way that you are living life right now is something that's problematic. Why don't you do something that I am asking you to do so, right? At no point does this mean that if at all that Dalit woman goes ahead and wants to go ahead and demand her rights, we do not extend support to her, right? But what does the difference in the cases that have been come up, like that you have been presented with, exist, right? The difference is simply that the simple idea that the Dalit woman herself is making the demand for her rights because of the fact that she herself is a citizen of India is something that's really important, and that literally proves that this is a regional conception, right? The simple idea that, and this is something you have agreed to in your POI, that it is a Western imposition, and we have a particular problem with this whole idea, right? We believe that quite often, due to adaptive preferences, human beings often give up rights, right? We believe that the simple idea that people give up bodily autonomy in the terms of like what kind of clothes to wear, on the contrary, and go ahead and get a sense of belongingness and community because there are particular rules in which communities function, etc., are often things that are not necessarily problematic. What does that mean? A person sitting in the USA going ahead and telling a Dalit woman in India that please go ahead and fight for your right to wear whatever you want, at a time that Dalit woman is okay wearing a blouse and a like petticoat in order to like ensure the fact that she remains acceptable in her community and remains happy and content, which is literally the point of human rights, is something that needs to be adhered to. It's something that needs to be respected. We do not think that you have engaged with this at all. I'll take you just after this point, right? Having established this particular idea, we further believe that support can indeed continue to exist, right? We believe that all kinds of like international pressure, diplomacy, blah blah blah, everything can continue to exist, but you go ahead and support the regional conception that that person within that country has, as compared to imposing externally, as you have agreed to in your POI, right? Having said that, let us look at the harms that come across because of this universal conception that exists, right? We believe that human beings, because of the fact that they're particularly rooted in their culture and like society, often have a sense of inferiority, and this is the first harm we come up with, right? This white man's burden is first of all not necessarily discharged in all instances, something that opposition has obviously failed to prove to us. But more importantly, the simple idea that you go ahead and put down people and their communities and cultures because of the fact that you are not living in the right manner, I will tell you how to live in the right manner, etc., are all things that are really important at a time. And I'll continue. Okay. Speaker, we believe that the existence of something called the SC/ST Atrocities Act is example of how demands can indeed turn into legislations, right? We believe that countries are often, through the bottom-up approach, often receptive to the kind of ideas that individuals within those communities can come up with, right? At no point does that discount the fact that you can't extend support or you can't go ahead and support these ideas, but it definitely means that you're putting down communities because of the fact that they are living in the wrong manner. It's a protected minute. They're living in a wrong manner, and we will tell you what the right right manner to live in is. Having said this, what is the other harm that we identify? And this is also an extension. We believe that attention being directed to human rights in this particularly unilateral manner often leads to a loss of focus on those influences that affect people's behavior the most. This leads to two very particular problems, right? This kind of an ideology that goes ahead and simply blames culture and religion, as has literally been done in opening opposition's case. Saudi Arabia is bad because Quran is telling them things. Quran is possibly bad. Quran is possibly not in support of human rights, etc., etc. The kind of reaction that this will lead to is a cultural self-defense mechanism, right? And this is a huge problem that exists in status quo. Until you can go ahead and prove that your universal conception is something that will be effective, until you can prove that this conception is something that will be accepted by people, there is absolutely no point in having a conception and rejecting regional ones. Very proud to stand with proposition.
I thank our member. I now invite our members to
Mr. Speaker, we think that the debate so far has been incredibly lacking in terms of principle, right? In terms of a debate which speaks about preferring a world where our whole conception of morality is so incredibly different from what we're so used to and what is universal, we think that argumentation in the debate has largely been on principle, has largely been lacking, right? While OO spoke about like harms of people having different rights and why it's bad to take away those rights, we'll be the first side in this debate to give you principle argumentation as to why the human condition essentially wants or will be a race to the bottom at the point at which you principally concede that rights are not universal, right? Before I move into what our extension, let me tell you about, let's deal with CG a little bit, right? Like first, they tell you that cultures themselves have full varied forms of determining rights for themselves, right? First, they don't give you any mechanism as to who these people are who are determining what rights a particular culture prescribes to, right? We largely think that this is going to be hegemonic in terms of the people who are already extremely superior or extremely privileged in those communities itself, right? And we think that they're essentially going to be people who want to take away rights from the other people, right? We'll give you reasons as to structurally why that happens through my extension, right? Second, they tell you that some people voluntarily give up rights and they're okay with that on a normal basis, right? Understand, Mr. Speaker, that as on a moral level, we can only be okay with this as long as they're exposed completely to the comparative, right? We don't really think that people would be willing to give up their rights unless they know, unless they're exposed to what the world would be in the when they had those rights in the first place, right? We don't really think that people can make those decisions, or those decisions inherently aren't free at the point at which they're not exposed to the comparative, which in their world simply wouldn't be the case because of hegemonic past telling you what those rights are and what not, right? Contrast that to rights and status quo, right? We think that largely even the rights that OG spoke about are accommodative, right? That they're moving upwards, right? They're giving people more rights to freedom, more rights to freedom to speech, freedom of association, right? That's what we stand for inside government, right? We think that in any case, these rights are universal and we must push for more and more rights, right? Why? First, Mr. Speaker, understand that people inherently want more rights, right? We think that inability, rights and freedoms are something that are inherently desirable, right? We think that people who live in places where they do have more rights are essentially happier, right? Why do we think this is so? We think that they have less fear, right? Less fear of being persecuted because of the way they are, right? Less fear of being like ostracized for what they can do, right? Or the consequences of their actions, right? We think that we also think that they're in these situations where they have more rights, they're more likely to self-actualize, right? In terms of being able to commit actions or live lives that make themselves more happier, right? We think that inherently more rights are more desirable, right? We think that given a choice between wanting more rights and given a world in which there are more versus given a world where rights are restricted, right? People would always choose the former, right? Like we think that inherently people push for more rights, right? Why do we think that the way the human condition is set up right now essentially wants the counter, right? We essentially think that people left on their own will want to take away rights of other people, right? First, we're told in status quo, Mr. Speaker, that competition is supreme, right? We're told things that the only way we can derive happiness in life is by winning, right? Is essentially by beating others, right? It's essentially by being the best, right? Is essentially by trampling on other people, right? It's essentially beating people to the rest, right? We're told that competition is so important to the extent where you must essentially trample down on other people's rights, right? The second important consideration in status quo is that people are born unequal, right? People are born unequal to the sense that some people have more access or more resources to other things, right? This can be things like talent, this can be things like capital, this can be any type of other things, right? Understand, Mr. Speaker, that these people, or even like a person without these talents, in the process of moving upwards, right? Essentially, the only way that you can compete, or the only way essentially that you can straight to win in life, is by taking away the rights of other people, right? Is essentially by trampling down other people, right? Is essentially by restricting their freedoms, is by essentially restricting their liberties, right? Simply by the way the world is set up and what we desire in life, that essentially entails the taking away of rights, right? What this proves is that this is going to be, or this is always going to be, a race to the bottom, right? Is when you allow people to interpret rights the way they want to and say that there is no universal concept of morality, right? Whatever it is, whether it's a right to life or a right to freedom, we essentially think that is always going to be a race to the bottom, where people who want to get more out of life, who want to compete more, who want to scale up the social ladders, are going to be taking rights away from those people who can't, right? By those people who don't have who have a lower starting point, right? Why is this? This is evidenced by the fact that, like, when dictators come into power, the first thing they do is to silence people, right? The first thing they do is to take away their rights, right? Simply because they have a reason to stay where they are, simply because they want to stay where they are, right? Where does this change when you have a universal conception of human rights, right? We think that this is the one thing that that doesn't let this race to the bottom go out of control, right? We think that when you prescribe to the idea that these are certain rights that are universal, right? That morality is always based around these, and that under no circumstances, of whether your religious backgrounds, the way you've come up with, or even your strive to success, right? That under no circumstances can you take away these rights, right? That's what acts as a check on this, right? We think that when principally you lose at the point at which you say that these are open to interpretation, right? That's when rhetoric saying that my cultural duties are more important and hence I am okay to take away my rights from other people, right? That's when you say that my reason for more economic actualization, or my reason to have more money for me or my family, is more important, and that legitimizes me taking away the rights of someone else, right? That's, we think, is inherently problematic in the world. I take closing. Right. So again, understand, Mr. Speaker, that we're okay with like a Western imposition, right? As long as it's protecting the most vulnerable in society, right? As long we're okay with like whatever the conception of human rights is, as long as it's universal, right? As long as it's not up to like debate, right? As long as people cannot continuously pose any reason for what it might be for them to take away those rights, right? We think principally you lose to the point and you allow this race to the bottom to take place when you concede that these things are up for interpretation, right? We think that concepts of morality, concepts of saying that I can't prioritize my social, my interests, or the interests of my family, or the interests of my country in or at the expense of one person's rights, right? We think that that's the type of morality that's keeping it in check, right? That's the basis of what human rights is built on, and that is fundamentally compromised at the point at which you say that you can leave other persons to interpret it, right? That's what they had to defend in this debate, right? They had to tell you as to why they were okay with principally undermining the concept of a universal human rights. The only thing we got is like a mechanistic quibble as to why courts won't be able to implement them, or why like cultures are undermined in this process, right? We think that more courts can be set up, implementation can be better, right? But at the point at which you principally undermine the concept of a universal human rights, you let a race to the bottom happen. We think rights should be taken away. Rights are inherently valuable, and for those reasons, we're proud to propose.
I now invite Lovely to close out the
Mr. Speaker, first a few specific rebuttals before moving on to our case. Right? This idea that in regional cultures and in regional conceptions of morality, human rights and the idea of human rights is legible based. We agreed that power structures exist, they are entrenched, and they are engendered to such an extent that certain local influences like religion and culture are ones which dictate them. However, right, and this is where whole of opposition bench has completely forgotten and has had this presumption that regional human rights and the regional conception of human rights is static, and this is what they have presumed, except it is not. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that in absence of any sort of an imposition from any other culture, there still existed a suffragette movement, there still existed a civil rights movement in the United States of America, divorced from any external imposition. Why is that, Mr. Speaker? That is because human rights like movements can only succeed at a point of time when they are conceived of and are propagated, not because someone else is telling us to, or not because there exists an abstract academic idea of what a Western culture and what Western imposition of human rights is, which they have considered just by the way, but because they are rooted in practicality after time. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that no possible conception of human rights when imposed on people can possibly exist, and this essentially takes down their whole case, right? Because what has their case been? And like the closing member just like considered right now that we need a principle. Except when this principle exists and when this principle is imposed, which also the opening considered that it is an Western imposition, then in that sort of a situation, you have something called a cultural defense mechanism, which does not let those human rights persist in that manner, and in fact defeats the propensity of them ever coming up. How does that happen? Mr. Speaker, we believe that regional conceptions of human rights can only change when the demand for their change is not based on saying that, look, my culture is inferior, and hence my culture should in fact accept something which is imposed from the West, but only when people come up and say that, look, what you're doing is something which is inherently wrong. Not because the West says that it's wrong, but because we as people feel denigrated because of them. Mr. Speaker, I'll give you a very good example of this, right? In the 1800s, where there existed no idea of universal human rights or westernization of human rights, a particular individual called Rajaram Mohan Roy came to India, like who was an Indian, and he said essentially that, sati should be abolished. He did not say that sati should be abolished because England says so or because United States says so, but essentially because these things are denigrating to the Indian women themselves, and it's like really, really wrong to do it, and it is bad for our culture in the first place to practice something of this sort. Mr. Speaker, had he in fact said that, we should ban sati not because like it's bad to women, but because West is imposing it on us, the situation in that would have resulted in backlash against him. And why is that, Mr. Speaker? Because we tell you that because culture and because religion is something which people feel so strongly about, the moment you attack that, right, rather than attacking the practice, the moment, and this is the universal conception of human rights, right, religion should be divorced and culture should be divorced from any sort of considerations of human rights. The moment you do that, you are essentially saying that a particular religion and a particular culture, in this case the Eastern one as compared to the Western one, is one which is inferior. After that, we tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the moment this is said, right, the moment it is said that your culture is inferior to mine, essentially what happens is that people are less likely to change. Why is it that people are less likely to change? Because in that sort of a situation, rather than accepting what the problem with their culture is and what the problem with their religious practice is, they are more liable to lash out at the people who in fact say that, like, this is something which is the case, because they do not agree that their culture is inferior in the first place. And hence, Mr. Speaker, essentially at the end of the day, this debate, the manner in which you judge this debate is in which side of the house is the propensity of change greater. Mr. Speaker, why do we tell you that the propensity of change is greater in our side of the house? And this is where they ask a key question in closing, right? They ask us that who are these people who will come up, please, who are these people who will come up and demand these changes in the first place? Mr. Speaker, we tell you that these are the direct stakeholders who are in fact being victimized because of these so-called cultural rights. Mr. Speaker, we do not believe that homosexuality should be criminalized. We do not believe that certain things with West says should not be a universal human right. But the moment they are garbed as universal human rights, the moment they are garbed in principle rather than practicality, is in fact when they face this backlash. Before moving on closing.
You can make sure that a common standard of morality is
Thanks.
exactly what I'm saying. Many religious clerics say many religious different things, right? So there exist Muslim clerics who in fact stand against triple talaq and things which are wrong with religion. And there exists propensity for change in religion because religion is so contested in itself. That is where, just by the way, you get that change from, and I'm very proud to stand here and say that. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about what happens in a situation where an imposition of cultural right in fact does happen, right? Mr. Speaker, we believe that a principle in isolation with its effects cannot be examined, no more favors. We believe that the principle in divorce with its practical impacts cannot be examined, right? So we tell you that if in Saudi Arabia you go and tell people that you know what you should say because the West says so, they will not, right? Essentially because they do not believe that what West says is right anyway. They will change the moment, no more otherwise. We believe that they will change when in fact the West, when the people within Saudi Arabia agitate for it. A very good example for it is the Dalit movement in India, right? And as my first speaker talked about. The reason that more Dalit people, that more untouchables in India are in fact getting more and more rights is not because the West came and told us that, oh, give rights to them, but in fact they demanded it on their own. Not on the Mr. Ambedkar never said that, oh, you know what, there exists a Western conception of human rights and hence we should demand and agitate for rights on that basis. In fact, what he said was that our own culture, our own religion, our own region is one which should be proud to embrace all cultures, all nationalities of people because of Vasudev Kutumbakam, which is essentially a Sanskrit saying which essentially means that the world is a family. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that the only way where in actual practices can be changed are when they are rooted in regional conceptions of human rights rather than a universal one, which they agree is westernized. Mr. Speaker, we tell you that we are the only team in this debate who has recognized what the practical problems with having a universal conception of human rights are. We believe that it would have been a great in a utopian world where people didn't have any religious or cultural affiliations to have a uniform conception of human rights, right? Except when they do, and when you go ahead and say something which is against what they inherently believe in that sort of a situation, you're less likely to bring about change. Mr. Speaker, what do you judge this debate on? Which side of the house is more likely to bring about change and bring about actual constructive change in the way people live, right? Mr. Speaker, we have pointed out that having a principle which is divorced from what the cultural teachings are will never be able to achieve that, because despite the existence of the UN Declaration of Human Rights for the last 60 years, the world is not really that significantly a better place. And the only thing that essentially will bring about change is people believe in it themselves. And I'm very proud to stand in front.
I thank Gavit and for the last speech of IIT Bombay
Mr. Speaker, a few questions to answer in this debate. Firstly, do these people or these regions actually deserve the right, or do these people actually need to determine what right to prioritize and what's best for them? OG comes up and tells you that it's okay because you you lose your right to vote and you get employment, etc., whatever. But they don't tell us why this decision people make is objectively correct or the right decision to make, because we have to understand how a global community functions. The way you exercise your rights, which is our exclusive extension, opening opposition said that this debate is about how this conception manifests in the real world, but we've given you analysis as to how this manifestation will actually occur in the form of a race to bottom and how you would always want to take away another person's right. So in the global community, what generally happens is that the way you exercise your rights also affects other people. So in that case, other regions or communities. So in that case, we don't really think giving them the right to decide what's best for them is justified, and they haven't given us any reason. Simply asserting it isn't enough. It's principally incorrect because it affects a large number of people. And the second reason as to why they give you is it's okay for these people to determine it is that enforcement is easier. They've given us no analysis and several missing links as to why these enforcement of these rights will be easier. why enforcement of these rights will be easier. They say that it's difficult, like both government benches say it's difficult because there's a Western conception that exists and you reject it. But we have to understand the dynamic that takes place within these regions. We still think there is a majority that would like to exercise their rights more. Like again, like tying that back to our extension that remains relevant across the entire government bench as to how you want more rights, and when you get more rights, we see that communities are generally happier. And so, like even within these regions, we think that like there exists a majority that is going to try and take away rights, even if it's like the right to religion or whatever. We like concede that these are extremely personal things to people, and that's when it furthers the narrative that it's okay to take away. That it's okay to take away our rights. Like, let's look at a comparative here. When you impose a universal conception of human rights versus when you impose a regional conception of rights, we think that in this region conception to rights, like on the basic level, you allow this sort of interpretation to take place that like different human beings can be assigned different amount of human rights, and that is what legitimizes or gives incentive to these people as a principle to take away rights from other people, saying that like my rights are more important, or like my religion is more important and what I need is more important, becomes takes front and center, and that is what we have a problem with, and that is how the manifestation is going to take place. I'm also going to deal with their best case where like these regions have implemented whatever rights, and that's still bad. Like what closing government wants, this sort of like evolution or change does not happen. Analyzing our extension a little further and like talking to you about why we take this debate over opening opposition and why it's more important. We've given you exclusive analysis in terms of examples, such as when you have an autocratic government, how they tend to exercise their power or exercise their power. They take away people's basic rights. They take away people's rights that are extremely important to them. So like in this way, we prove that our extension of the fact that the incentive to take away rights is greater exists, and when you set this sort of precedence, it furthers this narrative and it becomes a problem. Like it becomes a problem even in regions that they haven't defined clearly. It becomes a large scale problem because we do think these regional rights are probably going to be determined by things like religion or culture, and there is always going to be a majority and a minority, and when you legitimize that it's okay or your right can sometimes be more important than the next person, we think that is where the problem lies. I'll take one from closing. I'll talk to you, I'll come to that as to how regions evolve right now, right? Like they're saying that people are going to outright reject Western imposition and it's bad, but for their paradigm to work, what has to happen is that individual that is oppressed will themselves have to realize that they are being oppressed and then speak out and exercise the regional rights or whatever. That doesn't happen simply because of the dynamic that takes place in the region. Like we don't think these people have an alternative or are exposed to this right to wearing different clothes or whatever, and they have to give us a link as to how this individual will realize that they are being oppressed and then voice out their opinions. And we also think it's problematic in terms of them saying the SCST movements, etc., right? Like India has a constitution because it's derived from certain Western ideals like the British Constitution or whatever, and we think it's extremely important for regions to be exposed to this alternative that exists in terms of another constitution for these regions to evolve, and the change that they want on their side does not exist. They have to prove to us how suddenly these people will magically realize that some of their rights are missing and then champion for these rights. But even in the best case, even in the best case where these rights are implemented and everything's happy within these regions, we still think that they're going to be entrenched in their regional rights, and there's not going to be any room for them to change. Why is it important for these regions to evolve and change? That is when the global community as a whole functions, when there is a common understanding of what basic morality is, and that does not exist on their side, and that is what we have a problem with. Like opening government, like governments across the board says other things, like you're going to outright reject them, and like this right to life or whatever will be ensured, because maybe the majority will think later, oh, the minority is going to come and take away my rights. That's like completely that's such a flimsy argument. Like if that happened, then nobody would oppress nobody, and that does not happen in status quo. Like the nature of rights that are exercised are oppressive, and every step of the way, when you want to gain more rights, you become more oppressive. And this other thing about like religious leaders or whatever, like because there's one liberal religious leader that exists, like there is still a large majority with entrenched Islamic ideas that are oppressive to women. They have to deal with the spectrum of people that exist proud to oppose.
How do you stop the live stream?
Have you spoken to someone?
Yes. How do you stop the live stream?
बंद हो गया है क्या?